Topic 7, Person-Centered Counselling. So, Person-Centered Counselling was originally proposed by Carl Rogers, and it is a little bit different to what we discussed earlier in behavioral counseling theory. So, behavioral counseling theory talks about how you're conditioned by your environment. Your environment gives you a certain experience, and that changes your behavior. But contrary to that, person centered theory is actually an approach that helps people based on the philosophy that when people are treated honestly and genuinely, that is what brings about psychological growth, right? So even you could look at this like, think about a good friend, right? Or even a loved one, or a husband, or a mom, right? What is it that makes you change your behavior at times, right? It could be continuous genuineness, kindness, being treated well automatically or eventually promotes growth, right? So I remember like one of the areas that I kind of struggle with is being hospitable. Yeah, it's pretty challenging for me. But my husband is quite opposite, where he is very hospitable. And so we're total opposites with that respect, in that regard. But what happened was, eventually he would encourage me. I would see how he does things, and I mean, like the way he would, like the way he treats me, even when like I may not do it right, still, I was not blamed for it. But eventually that helped me change my behavior. And I'm sure you could think of hundreds of examples where when you have the right people in your life, how being treated right makes you change and become a better person. So back to counseling, this is what person-centered theory is about. Person-centered, we are focusing on the person, right? And the way we treat the person would determine how their behavior changes, how they grow, right? So there are concepts of person-centered approach, just like behavioral theory had certain concepts. Well, let's look at each of these in detail. So the first concept is phenomenology, right? I know it's a big word, right? But think about it like this: as individuals, we all have our own unique view about the world, right? And this unique view of the world comes based on our background and the way we look at things, right? So any situation at all, if you take 5 individuals, they would look at it in 5 different ways, right? And this is your phenomenology, the way the person perceives the world based on his view and his perception, right? So sometimes when people go through problems, they will be like, what, that's a crazy way to look at it. No, but that is their phenomenology, that is how they look at things, right? So sometimes children who are overwhelmed with fear, right, it is sometimes based on the way they interpret a situation, their view of what would happen. Like I've heard of working currently with a case where this child is had lost a loved one very suddenly, and that shock has caused him to fear that that fear has gripped him, where he is really scared to be away from his parents, and he can't go to school because he's overwhelmed by fear, right? So you might think that is madness. No, it is based on how the child perceives his world, right? And that has happened because of what he has gone through, right? And nurses, you might have patients who come from various backgrounds, right? Sometimes they might not have sometimes they may have lost all hope. You might even meet suicide cases, right? Why? Because of their phenomenology, sort of the way they look at the world and their perceptions about the situation, right? And then there is also, right, every individual has this concept of knowing, right? So there are three ways. One thing is there are things that uh, you know, that only you know, which is interpersonal, right? And there are things that others may know about you that you wouldn't know about yourself, right? And there will also be things that you would think that is your opinion about things, which is subjective, right? So there are things that others would know about you which sometimes you wouldn't know about yourself, which is objective, right? So at last we'll see how all these things comes together, right? So what happens is an individual is basically the center of all experiences. Like they say, everything happens to people, right? So what happens is, you know, all the time we are caught up in this world, we're caught up in situations, right? And all kinds of experiences which kind of sometimes really rock the boat. It like really gets us into either where it makes us happy, or it could just move us to the other pole, which is depression, right? So every time you're always in the midst of a lot of challenging experiences, right? And at the same time, every person has a concept of their self, that is the me in everything, right? So sometimes there will be instances where, you know, when something is said or something is written, you would just know that it is that person. Why? Because of that self expression, right? So this concept of self is unique to every person, right? So that is your personal characteristics, how you deal with it. It's your perception of relationships, right? How you look at things, which constructs the concept of self. But at the same time, there is also a concept of what is known as an ideal self. That is the self that we want to be, right? So sometimes you might see, okay, people that, okay, this person is really generous, is helping everybody, is very kind, and you might set that bar and think, no, this is who I ought to be, right? And you try, because that is the self you like to be, right? Another good example is, this is why people always look at the perfect body shape, the perfect weight, the perfect height, the perfect figure for us women, right? Why? Because this is what is related to what is known as our ideal self, what we think we should be, right? But we'll later talk about why this becomes a problem, why the ideal self, how it becomes a problem in a person's life, right? So Rogers actually focused on that people usually they try to change, right? So he focuses on the view towards personality, which emphasizes perfection to change. So usually if you look at people, anybody, right, likes to move from dependency to independency. Okay, so why is it that even right, if you ask a person, okay, do you want to work under somebody or do you want to be the boss, right? Everyone, I think more than 99% might say, hey, I want to be the boss. Why? There is a sense of independency when you are the boss, right? But being the boss is not an easy job, right? So anytime at all, you know, you talk, nobody would talk about, okay, being trapped and being dependent. Everybody likes to be independent, right? Also, people usually they prefer change to constancy, right? Because sometimes if your life is in the same monotonous pattern, you get bored. So change is good, right? And also people like change, and they also enjoy freedom. Every human being wants to feel free, right? And also people focus on more satisfaction and enjoyment, which is why you may do a job, you're paid for it, right? But if you get a break, right, irrespective of how much money you may be losing, you're happy. Why? Because humans focus on satisfaction and enjoyment, right? And all people are creative. Now you might say, hey, I'm not creative, because you might look at creative as being only being able to do something artistic. No, you might be creative in your profession, right? Maybe you know really well how to handle your patients. Teachers, you might know well how to handle your kids. You might come up with creative teaching ideas. Nurses, you might come up with interesting therapeutic techniques, right? So all people have this sense of creativity within them, right? And of course, having said that, also everybody works to maintain consistency, right? So even if you look at right, anybody, why are you working? Why? You want to stabilize yourself, right? Anything at all, right? When things don't go our way, we feel sad, but we are longing for the time when that sadness will just move out of our bodies and we feel happy again. Why? Because we want to maintain consistency, right? Okay. So what happens is, now when having said that this is how people grow and this is what they need, right? They need to, if you take a person, they have their own view about the world, they have knowledge about themselves, and at the same time these are the aspects they grow in. Now what happens when a person is faced with an unexpected situation, right? Now here we say that usually an ideal person, okay, would be congruent. You know the theory of congruency with triangles, right? So that means you're stable, you're in like this position of equilibrium. But when a person faces an unexpected situation, right, now that is when they can't, it's difficult for them to maintain that constancy, right? Now they have moved into a state of disequilibrium. They are pretty confused, their boat has been rocked, okay? So in order to try to stabilize themselves again, there is a chance that they would deny the problem, right? So I find this sometimes when I have to tell parents, your child is having a learning difficulty, right? Or else your child is, having hyperactivity, and immediately, for a parent, hearing this is not the easiest thing in the world, and this is unexpected, right? Especially with learning disabilities, I notice, because sometimes they're so smart but they're unable to read and write. And the moment you share this, right, immediately the parent, one of the reactions we see is they say, no, but then can't it be because of this? Can't it be, maybe I should spend more time, maybe, the teacher is not doing her job, maybe can't it be this reason, that reason? All right, why? Because they're trying to find some congruence in this whole thing. They're trying to stabilize themselves, okay? They are trying to get back to the state of congruency. So because of that, they might even deny the problem, right? And I faced this issue several times with people. So nurses, sometimes when patients are given a diagnosis, right, like, okay, hypertension or hypoglycemia, right, right, sometimes there might be patients who might even ask you, are you sure your meter is working right? Are you sure the pressure gauge, the pressure the pressure meter or whatever is working right? Are you sure you use the correct thing? Maybe I should go for a second opinion. Why? Because this is an unexpected situation and it has really turned their whole world around, right? So personality growth happens when the person is able to develop, when they are able to understand their experiences, right? Learn to deal with it, which helps them become more free, right? And growth is something that happens naturally, right? You don't need to, like, nobody can make another person grow. You can help, you can nurture the person, right? But the process of growth occurs naturally, right? So psychological disorders happens, right, when, okay, if you take a healthy person, right, they are able to adjust with situations, right? But if you take an unhealthy person, right, remember we spoke about the ideal self. I told you in a little while I will tell you how the ideal self becomes a problem, right? So sometimes, right, the person thinks that they ought to be this great person, but actually who they are is not parallel to what they claim to be, right? So you get these people, sometimes they might boast about their abilities and all, but actually, right, so once I remember I had a kid who used to say that he could play any instrument, he owned so many guitars and all, but he had just started learning to play the guitar, right? So if you look at him, the ideal self, his ideal concept of self is being a fantastic guitar player, but right now he doesn't have the skill. So you see, his structure, his real self is not parallel with his ideal self, and there's a big gap, and that can cause a person to get depressed. It can cause a person might sometimes even to be narcissistic, right? All kinds of psychological disorders could happen when this gap is quite high, right? And then you also get issues where people deny, right? So even recently there was a case where the wife said, I really want to go for counseling, but my husband just denies that he has a problem, and he refuses to go. So sometimes when you deny experiences also, it can lead to a psychological disorder, right? And if the person is intolerant, right, defensive or defending incongruent, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm this perfect person, right? That also can be another cause for psychological disorders according to person-centered approach. So Carl Rogers said, in order to be able to work with clients, there are three core conditions. One is the counselor has to be in a state of congruence, meaning the counselor can't be in a state of discongruency, right? The counselor must be stable, right? And you have to be in because a position of congruency, and you have to be able to accept the client no matter what, right? And sometimes yes, getting back to congruency, one of my principles are, if I am having a bad day, or if I am sick, right, if I'm upset about something, I don't see clients that day, because I know I need to be in a state of congruency for me to help another person, right? And then there's unconditional positive regard, right? Meaning you accept the client for who they are. And yes, when you're counseling, you will hear all kinds of things, right? So sometimes there might be married people saying that, okay, I'm having an affair with this person, I know it's wrong, but I have, right? You can't reject a person at that point. You have to accept. We're not accepting the behavior, right? But you have to accept the person, because unless you accept the person, you can't help that person change. and also a whole lot of empathy. So I think you must be knowing empathy means getting into that person's shoes and feeling like the way that person would feel in that situation, right? So the more experience you have in life, the more empathetic you can be, right? So I have gone through grief, right, a couple of times in my life, and I know what it is like. So it's easy for me to understand what another person is going through, their thought process, their feelings, and I'm able to empathize with them, right? And empathy is very important because that is how we could make another person feel that they are being heard, that we understand how they feel, right? We understand what they're going through, and empathy is the way we can convey that to them. And nurses, you will have patients who have maybe gotten deadly diagnoses, right? Especially with those who are terminally ill, or maybe people who have been subjected to domestic violence, right? Maybe patients with a lot of pain, and they need empathy, right? So once I remember there was this nurse who said they should know that yes, it's true, what we do is painful, but they should know that, right, we're doing it to make them better. Well, that is not empathy. How would you feel if you had to go through pain, right? So empathy is knowing that yes, sometimes what you do could be, but then at the same time understanding that they are going through a lot, they react this way for that reason, right? Okay. So, what kind of therapy conditions do we need? Well, it's very important that you build a good relationship. For any sort of counseling to happen, it all begins with a relationship, right? So sometimes when people ask me for psychologists or for counselors, I always give them a list and I tell them, see whom you're comfortable with, whom you can build a relationship, whom the psychologist is also able to build a relationship with. So the relationship really matters, because with a good relationship also comes trust, right? And I remember when I work with children, I told you about a boy who was very scared of furry objects. I was able to help him face his fears, not only because of my knowledge in psychology, but also because we had a very good relationship. He trusted me. So when I was there supporting him, helping him face his fear, he trusted me that I'm not just going to push him in the deep end and leave him there, right? So building a good relationship with the client is key. It is very important, right? And also there's this psychological situation the client goes, so you have to understand, you have to empathize and understand the situation the client is going through, right? And also the attitude of the counselor, whether you like it or not, sometimes when you talk, the client would know whether whether you're a person they could approach or not, right? So your attitude matters, right? The way you talk to the client, right? From the way you say things, they are read as much as you're reading them, they read you. So the attitude of the counselor would determine whether the client will come to you or not, right? So what are the counseling skills here, right? We have discussed this in chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken. It's chapter 2 or 3, right? So I think you're very familiar with these terms of questioning, right? You know that when areas are not clear, you need to question, right? When you need to encourage them to voice out what they're going through, right? And not just listen to them for hours and hours. At certain breaks, you need to paraphrase so that and summarize so that they know that you have been listening to them and you haven't spaced out, right? There are times when you have to reflect their feelings and tell them, okay, you reacted this way for this reason, right? Validate the feeling, right? And there are times when they might contradict themselves. There will be times when what they say might be irrational, which needs to be confronted. But confrontation is also a risky technique because sometimes the client might take offense. So you have to be very careful how you confront the client, right? And with some clients, they would talk about so many other things. So it's important to keep focusing them back to what they have been talking, what they were talking about, right? And also sometimes they would struggle to understand what they're going through, right? But as a counselor who looks at the situation, you can always reflect the meaning of what is going on, right? So I really hope that this was useful, especially nurses, since you spend a lot of time with with patients. These are some skills that you need to develop, right? So that your patients, because one thing is, if they say healthy mind, healthy body, and the other way around, right? And if your patient is treated well, the sooner they would recover as well. Okay, thank you.